Second speaker is our second speaker is Falster. He's from UNSW. And yeah.
Hey folks, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. And can you see slides?
Yes, all good.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to present. I appreciate that many people here are working directly with these models. Isaac Towers is here with me in lovely Coffs Harbour and has helped me prepare this work. We're coming in as a bit of outsiders, having neither run Cable or Jules. And we're here because we think we've got overlapping interests in understanding how the vegetation works. And we're vegetation ecologists. We're interested in understanding the rules by which plant ecosystems function. We're curious how these dynamics can either inform or are already in models like Cable. And so thanks for the opportunity to present. Right, so what I want to do in this talk is talk across three different areas that we feel like we have emerging understanding of how plant ecosystems work and why this might be important in a land surface model. And then finally, sort of some ideas on how to test and maybe implement some of this. And apologies if I don't give credit to existing work. I've tried to follow what the models can do, but I'm certainly I'm likely to have missed something. So the first area is on trait gradients, and this is a big focus of my lab's research. If we move across the Australian landscape from an arid ecosystem on the left through to the wet sclerophyll, dry sclerophyll, wet sclerophyll, and eventually rainforest, we see big structural changes in the vegetation. What we're really interested in is finding whether there's also big changes in the traits of organisms as you traverse environmental gradients, and these will reflect long-term adaptive features of the vegetation, which affects how they function. There's not a lot of data that's been available on this, despite huge amounts of research. So in our lab, we've led a national effort funded by the Australian Research Data Commons to compile trait data. We've released publicly the Austrates trait data set that puts together over 370 different trait data sets. We've got over 1.8 million records. And there's a lot of traits, and as you may know, these span up to 30,000 different plant taxa in Australia. This is led by Lizzie Wenck in my lab. This crowd won't be interested in a majority of those traits, but there are definitely some that you really would be interested in. And here's an analysis that Isaac's has out in a preprint at the moment. And there's traits here like Huber value. Can you see my mouse out of interest?
Yes, all good.
Yep. Huber value, nitrogen per area affecting photosynthetic rates, leaf mass per area, wood density, all of which are in various land surface models. And what you can see is these really strong gradients with mean annual precipitation. So as we move from, I thought I had another slide in here. All right, a slide is missing. As we move from dry areas to wet areas, we're seeing systematic shifts in the characters of the vegetation and that are affecting things like biomass allocation, photosynthesis, growth rates, and so forth. A second part of our, and broadly what this entails is at the dry end, you're shifting from traits which are very resource conservative, which make very tough sort of long-lived tissues so that you can endure dry conditions, to at the wet end, traits which are much more aggressively focused on growing fast and are more risky strategies. The second part of our work is on understanding why these shifts happen, and here we use an eco-evolutionary modeling approach where the goal is to predict the traits from first principles by simulating plant growth and fitness under different environments. So based on a model of plant ecophysiology, which will have some overlap with the sorts of ecophysiology in land surface models, we simulate, I won't go into the details, but we simulate some idea of how plants with hypothetical trait values would do in terms of some metric of fitness. We find the optimum for a particular environment, and we can plot that across the environmental gradient and compare it to data. So here's a couple of examples that Isaac's been working on. This is sapwood area to leaf area, so the amount of sapwood that's supporting each unit of leaf area. here's the predictions from our optimal model across a soil wetness gradient. And here we're thinking not so much of short-term dynamic shifts in soil wetness, but more long-term shifts in the average soil wetness as you go, for example, from an arid system to a rainforest system. And what you're seeing is that the predicted value is shifting. And here's the data that we have to the extent we have it in Austrates, and it seems to be aligning quite nicely in terms of the absolute value and the direction of the change. Maybe not the curvature of this, but we're getting reasonable qualitative agreement there. And this is mean annual rainfall flipped around so that it's in the same axis as this here, so from wet to dry. Second trait is the conductivity of the stem. Plants, you know, they have vessels which transport the water from the bottom to the top, and the diameter of these vessels can, because resistance scales non-linearly with the surface area to volume ratio, the larger vessels are more efficient at conducting water. And so the conductivity per unit of stem is much higher for species with large vessels than it is for small vessels. And Isaac's model predicts that you'd see a strong gradient as you go from dry environments to as you go from wet environments where you'll have very high conductivity per unit sapwood area, to dry environments you'll have very low conductivity. That's driven also because the conductivity is connected to a risk of xylem embolism. It's much more likely in large vessels, and so we have a trade-off between the conductivity and embolism risk. And again, this seems to match qualitatively the sort of shifts we're seeing across gradients in the Australian ecosystems. Here's the slide I thought we were missing. It is here. So both empirically and from modeling first principles, we think we see shifts, coordinated shifts in traits across climatic gradients. And I've focused here mainly on rainfall because that's the predominant thing that's impacting these Australian communities. Now here, why I think this might influence the behavior of models. This is, while it looks cartoonish, this is model output from a model we've run where we've looked at height growth rate. You could also have leaf area growth rate, biomass productivity. And in this example on the left, we've just run a single trait set. Now in models like cable, most of the ecosystems I've shown you would be considered by a single PFT, probably the broadleaf evergreen biome. And so this is the type of behavior you might see in the model where you're going to get better growth in wetter soil, but it's going to drop off at some point as it heads out towards regions where it can't survive. From an ecologist point of view, we expect that you'll have species which at the wet end can grow much, much faster because they're specializing they have traits which specialize on fast growth. So this single PFT will get replaced by outcompeted at the favorable end. And at the dry end, you're going to get out-survived by things which are better survivors. And so here's a more realistic idea of what we think is going on. We've taken our model, we've optimized traits in different environments, so at different points along the gradient, and then we've run all those species out along the whole gradient. And what you can see is that the species which is adapted to good conditions can grow much, much faster in those conditions, but then drops off really rapidly because it's a more risky strategy. Meanwhile, at the other end, you have a drought tolerator that's able to extend right out into much more harsh conditions. But even under good conditions, it's going to grow much slower because the traits of that species constrain its growth even under good conditions. Okay, so that's the first component. The second component is diversity within arid areas. And I wonder whether how the dynamics are being represented in the model and whether we're missing something which could help resolve what I've heard from people like Anna and Andy talking about, that the land models can perform poorly or as Anna says here, impacts of drought on dry land vegetation. And in particular, that might be because they tend to take that single PFT and extend it out into drier and drier vegetation where it's less suited. So this species here is a mulga. It's very drought adapted. And as I sort of suggested in the previous section, it may have a set of traits which allow for it to continue to grow in difficult conditions, despite the difficult conditions. So that will be part of the story. But then you can see there's all these other things here. And this is a pretty dry site out at Sturt National Park. It's about 300 millimeters of rainfall per year. So it's quite at the extreme end. But you can see all these other things here, which have a pretty green, lush sort of characteristic. And these are drought avoiders. They don't grow in the drought. They grow in wet times. And in our lab, we've been mapping the fraction of the native species that are annuals across the continent. And you can see that as you go into the center of Australia, this is unpublished work, but you can be pushing up to 50% of the species. This isn't the cover, but 50% of the species that are annuals. And these are likely like drought avoiders where they pop up in the wet periods after rain. So why, and this matters because these drought avoiders have the opposite set of traits. So here's the same data that I showed you earlier in the orange, where in dry environments, you have very like tough leaves and so forth. But in the blue here, we have the non-woody species, and you can see they have leaves which are like being in a rainforest. And you can see that in this species here. It's got tons of light, it's got nice moist soil, it's happy as anything, it's growing like crazy. Haven't got data on something like wood density because people don't tend to consider this as wood, but if we measure the density of the stems, it'd be way down here somewhere. So we have these two very contrasting strategies going side by side. Now, this will be the most scientific plot you'll see for the day. I'm sorry about the quality, but I just wanted to get the idea across. If we were looking at what happens in this ecosystem through time, we've got some dry time here, and then we've got a rainfall sort of couple of months, and then it dries out again. My understanding of the way a model like Cable is behaving is that in the dry time, you're shutting down, the plants are shutting down much more than they maybe would, than a mulga would. And so you have very low evapotranspiration. And then as soon as it becomes wet, it ramps up really quickly and then shuts down again relatively abruptly. How that might be different, I think, is with these two strategies is firstly, the mulga is a tolerator, and so it's going to sort of eke out a living much more than our current strategies in the model. But when it rains, because it's got a set of traits that really constrain how fast it can grow, it only shows a bit of a bump in growth. Meanwhile, you have this annuals system, which could include the grasses as well. I heard one of the previous speakers talking about grasses and the fraction of grass versus woody and so forth. But the key point here is this is a system with both things growing together. The annuals will take a little while to get going because they're coming back from seed, but then they really get going and then fall in a heap again. And so when you add these two together, you're going to get a different signal of the way the ecosystem is behaving than a single woody type with traits that suit further east. Okay, my third example is about biomass allocation. And what I've been hearing from the community is that your community is that it has very high uncertainty. It's very important, but I wanted to think about like, what can we say about that could be useful? And looking back at the way Cable is set up, and I believe it's still this way, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got a differential equation, the amount of carbon going into different tissue pools, where I is the different tissue pools, you've got the net primary production, and then you've got these constants here, A, which is the fraction going into leaf, wood, root. Sounds superficially very sensible and almost mathematically has to be true. The challenge is, where do these A's come from? And since you're dealing with an average behavior of an entire ecosystem, this is very, very difficult to measure. I can't imagine how you would measure it. But anyway, you have different biomes or PFTs with different values going into these things. And as at least in this paper, they're referencing back to an older model where I'm not quite sure where these particular values came from. But at least in principle, if we could improve what these values are, we should be able to improve how well the model does. We model things quite differently. You will end up with this mathematical breakdown, but we don't start with a set of constant A's. In the models that I work with, we start with two functional relationships, which we can measure empirically. So this is data from a database I put together called the Biomass and Allometry database, where we compiled lots of data from around the world on how plants are constructed. And the model I work with has these two founding rules at its core. One is that as a plant grows, its height is related to its leaf area. All these blue lines are lines fitted to a particular species, collection of data for a particular species at some point around the world. And the black line is what we drive our model with this. There's a generic relationship. Similarly, the sapwood area will be coordinated with the leaf area. We then put this into a size-structured population model where we're modeling the dynamics of many cohorts of species, of individuals, and for different species, all growing in competition with each other with a physiological foundation and competing for light. So in the red here, we have individuals of a faster growing species, shorter but faster growing, a bit like acacia, growing up quickly after a disturbance event, and then starting to die out where it's getting lighter here. And then we have a slower growing, still reasonably quick species that eventually overtops it. And this might be, for example, a eucalypt species that's growing up, pretty quick, but also slightly behind the acacia. A typical sort of dynamics that you might see in many Australian ecosystems. Now, the key point here is, this is pretty uncontroversial from an ecosystem dynamics point of view. We can then map what these two species are doing in terms of their biomass allocation in the model. And so here's the leaf fraction in green here for this species and here for this species. And you can see that it's varying as the plants get bigger and taller. We've got other things in here, root bark, sapwood, heartwood. And in an ecosystem, you're going to have patches in different stages of development governed by some disturbance regime. And so this black line here is the probability density of patch states in a broader ecosystem. And my key point is the constants you have in cable are basically trying to average over all of these different dynamics where you've got size structured populations, multiple species with different traits and in different stages of development in the ecosystem. So that's really, really hard. And I think there's potentially a role for more detailed models like the ones that we work with to study this process of biomass allocation and try and come up with values for these constants that you need to make the land surface models run. And on that, I think there's multiple, I was fascinated to hear Luigi's talk earlier about the various data sets that are around. I was thinking about what data sets I knew of that might be useful for constraining biomass allocation at broad scales. And there's Stephen Roxburgh's put together the maximum biomass layer in Australia, which is, from a CSIRO product and based on lots and lots of field data. There's the Tern forest height map. We have Austraits where we have data like wood density, leaf mass per area, and so forth. And these seem like they should all be brought to bear on the problem. Okay, so there's my 3 points. And the last slide will be a possible pathway to test and implement. How am I going for time? Am I got 1 more minute?
Yeah, 1 quick minute.
Yeah. So my current view of a model, you have some parameters, and then to account for different biomes, you've maybe broken that into a parameter sets, which are different biomes, and together you'll get some outputs, which you'll put into Gab's system and eventually get some plumber plots, which would be really nice. One avenue for improving representation would be make the model more complex, put more dynamics in there, but I appreciate the need to keep the models as light and tight as possible, and that's a very long endeavor that we probably wouldn't want to embark on. Another would be to make many, many more PFT sets, which also introduces complications because these are going to be multiplicative across environmental space and computationally expensive. So an alternative idea, which I've loosely discussed with some of you, is that what if we could make parameter maps where we map the mean climate onto things like traits or biomass fractions, which could inform, basically you had one woody PFT, but the woody PFT would change in its parameters in response to the sort of climate that it's been experiencing on some time scale. And perhaps to get those maps, they could be empirically measured, but perhaps what we need is a separate parallel activity like the one we're doing, where we're looking at the parameters and we're using high resolution models to understand those and predict those and generate surfaces of parameters which could feed into cable. I'm really interested to explore whether this is a useful contribution and something I should think about working on. I'm very keen to hear if other people are interested in this. Also, critiques of the idea. Thanks very much.
We only have time for one good question.
Thanks, Daniel. Jürgen speaking here. I was wondering if your biomass allocation scheme is also applicable to herbaceous plants, or how you would modify it to make it applicable to herbaceous plants or those without a separate capacity.
I struggle to hear there, Jürgen. Is it also applicable to herbaceous plots? Is that right?
Plants, yeah.
I mean, yes and no. Yes and no. Some herbaceous things do weird things. They grow in entirely different ways. Grass would be an example. We'd need to think more about how to apply it to grass. Lots of herbaceous things, in my view, are just like woody plants with lighter tissues and that stop maturing at a much smaller height. So in that sense, yes, I think that broad sort of scheme could work. But I think the data would tell us how well it could work.
Thank you. That's